Thank you all for being here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Today's presenter is Sebnem Gumuscu. She is an assistant professor of political science at Middlebury College and the author of Democracy or Authoritarianism, Islamist Governments in Turkey, Egypt, and Tunisia, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. She is also the co-author of Democracy, Identity, and Foreign Policy in Turkey, Hegemony Through Transformation, written in 2014, and is the author of numerous journal articles on political Islam, dominant parties, and democratic erosion. We're very happy to have you here today, Sebnem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria, so much for the invite, and I'm happy to be here. Hopefully this is going to be an interesting conversation for everyone. And let me share my screen because I have a presentation that I want to use, a couple slides that I want to show, and hopefully that will generate some discussion at the end. And I hope to leave a good amount of time for Q&A. I told Gloria that I'd be happy to answer questions about my other projects, although I will be talking about this particular topic today, how democracies die, lessons from Turkey. So let me get started with the three things that I want to do today. Number one, I want to talk about the current crisis of democracy that we observe globally, not just in Turkey and a couple other countries, but globally. And I'm going to talk about the fundamental features of that recent democratic crisis, what we call in political science a reverse wave of democracy. And I will spend quite a bit of time talking about Turkish case and what we know about the ongoing democratic backsliding in the country and the general trend in the world. So let's start with this statement. Democracy is in decline in the world, in multiple different countries. And this decline is not just about a democratic retrenchment or backsliding in some parts of the world like the Middle East or Asia or Africa. It's actually also touching significantly consolidated democracies in Europe as well as North America. So many Western European countries, as well as Eastern and Central European countries, and also United States is actually touched by this decline, maybe at a lesser degree than other countries. So this graph is actually coming from a Varieties of Democracy project. Two authors who contributed to that project published an article in 2019, and they summarize what's going on in terms of democratization and autocratization in this particular graph. Let me walk you through this graph and what it actually means. So in this more than 100 years of human history, recent human history, you actually see the number of countries that are going through democratization in the dotted line. So in political science, we do not treat, many of us actually in political science, at least, do not treat democracy and autocracy as a binary. We don't say a country is a democracy or autocracy. We're actually kind of, treat this as a continuum. So if we give scores from 0 to 100, 100 being perhaps perfect democracy and 0 being perfect autocracy, any country can actually be located in along this continuum. So a country that actually scores 100 may actually go through democratic backsliding and lose its democratic qualities over time and go back to perhaps scoring 90, 80, 70, and so on and so forth. So these lines actually tell us the changes in the world in different countries that we observe a long time. So here, in this dotted line, you actually see the number of countries that are going through democratization, those countries that actually are getting higher scores in their democracies, quality of democracy. And in the solid line, you actually see those countries that are becoming more and more autocratic over time. So here you can see we're indeed going through a third reverse wave, almost like what we have lived through in the interwar era, or the 1960s and early 1970s. So this particular episode in history that started quite a bit after perhaps the turn of the millennium, shows us the number of countries going through autocratization has exceeded the number of countries going through democratization, which means we are going through an autocratic wave or a democratic reverse wave. So this is a bit worrisome for a number of reasons, and particularly when we compare this reverse wave with what we have seen in the past, we see that the actors of this democratic reverse wave is very much different this time around. And those actors are actually elected officials rather than generals in uniform, as you can see in these pictures from Chile in 1970s. So the elected officials, they come to power in free and fair elections, and they use the legal democratic institutions and tools that are available to them to undermine democratic politics. We call this stealth autocratization or very incremental autocratization, because when you use legal tools, when you go through the system to undermine the system itself, it's very slow moving and very incremental. And I will explain how that's the case in a minute, using Turkey as an example. Of course, when you think about a military coup or an intervention, it is much more rapid and very much kind of abrupt and to democratic rule, as we have seen in many countries in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, especially in 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And when we compare this particular instance of democratic reverse, current reverse wave, with previous reverse waves, we also see that this is a much less violent reversal of democracy, again, compared to what we have seen in interwar Europe or also military interventions in the past. And maybe the most critical of them all is because these actors that undermine democracy are elected officials, they also come to power and stay in power with popular support, which creates an urgency for political scientists and all analysts and also concerned citizens who want to understand why that's the case, to unpack the causes behind such substantial popular support for anti-democratic politics. Okay. So let me show you one more graph, and I promise I will not bore you with more graphs. This is actually a good summary of executive takeovers over the years, telling us that democracies now collapse and break down, not at the hands of military officers and generals. They're actually killed by executive officials. So when you look at these numbers over time, you actually see from 2000 to 2020, the overall average number of democratic breakdowns, at least 80 to 90% of them is actually killed by elected officials. And the graph is coming from Swolik's study in 2019. Okay, so let's unpack this and try to understand how that happens with a closer look at Turkey. So for those of you who don't know much about Turkey, let me give you a little bit of context here. Turkey is a middle-income country. Recently, it has about $8,000 per capita income, and we have about 80 million people living in the country. So it's a sizable middle-income country, and it has a long history, relatively long history of democratic politics. So the very first multi-party politics, free and fair elections, happened in 1950. And it was a parliamentary system for a long time where multiple parties ran in elections in a very much kind of in a free and fair fashion. And those parties who actually prevailed in elections, won the elections, they came to power and governed the country for several decades. And of course, there were some moments when democratic politics were interrupted with military interventions, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But besides those, couple of years of interruptions, we actually have continuous multi-party politics since 1950 until very recently. Turkey actually has close ties to the West, including the United States, through NATO membership that was established in 1952. And Turkey has been also aspiring to become a European Union candidate member state. And it is a candidate state since 2005. So negotiations with the European Union is ongoing. and Turkey is trying to become a member to the European Union. So it has relatively strong ties to the West. So when you think about all these features, Turkey being a middle-income country with a long history of democratic politics, a NATO member, EU member candidate state, there are a number of puzzles that actually we need to address. So how is it possible for a middle-income country with strong ties to the West and with a long history of democratic politics to break down? How the democracy die in the country? So this is not the first time, again, that Turkish democracy broke down. I already mentioned that there were at least two military interventions that basically killed Turkish democracy in the past. And you can see how in 1960, the first military intervention, and in 1980, the second military intervention basically led to the breakdown of Turkish democracy very abruptly, right? So these are military interventions, generals coming taking over power from the elected civilians, and they basically rewrite the constitution, create a new democratic system, and go back to their barracks. And when they go back to their barracks, the country goes back to democratic politics. So these two are very much similar in many different respects, because in first, both of these instances, it was a military intervention that caused democratic breakdown. The third and the final episode that I'm going to talk about today is actually a much more incremental death of democracy. As you can see, pretty much starts in mid-2000s, and then you see somewhat of an erosion of democratic quality, and then an abrupt decline, and then stagnation of democracy's course. So this was a quite slow-moving incremental process that did not happen through a military intervention as it did in 1960s and 1980, but it actually happened through a elected government and the ruling party pretty much taking measures that undermine democratic politics. So how did democracy die in Turkey then? So maybe the most important actor that was involved in this process is Tayyip Erdogan, the current president of the country, and he came to power in 2003. His party was elected to office in 2002, but he actually became the prime minister a couple of months later in 2003. There are a couple of things that created that lag. We can talk about it in the Q&A. So let me talk a little bit about Erdogan and his significance in Turkish politics. So he is coming from a immigrant family of urban lower income background. So his family is from a small northern city in Turkey, and they moved to Istanbul, and he's raised in Istanbul, in a lower income neighborhood in Istanbul. Then he becomes quite active in politics, first in local branches of political parties, the Islamist movement at the time, and he quickly moves up the ladder of local politics, and he becomes the mayor of Istanbul in 1994. He has significant charisma and also organizational genius. So he's really good in mobilizing his supporters, organizing local branches, and he does a good job in 1994 elections. So he is elected the mayor of Istanbul. Istanbul, for those of you who don't know Turkey that much, is the largest city of the country with the largest population, and also a very significant bastion of its economic activity. So according to Erdogan, and many other analysts would agree with that, whoever wins Istanbul, its municipality, actually wins Turkey. So that's exactly what happened with him. In 1994, he was elected the mayor of Istanbul. He did a good job as the mayor. And then he's established a political party in 2001, the AKP. And AKP got elected in multiple cycles in 2002, 2007, 2011, and 2015. Then we see a shift in the political system from parliamentary system to a presidential system. I will talk about that in a second. And he served as the president in the new system since 2018. So you can see because it was a parliamentary system at first, there were no term limits over the prime minister's position. So Erdogan served as prime minister from 2003 to 2014, and then he was elected as a president, like an interim president, let's say, and then as an executive president in 2018. Now he has 2-term limits over his power. That's the detail, but what we need to kind of understand from this, he has basically been ruling the country for 20 years now, right? So that's very important because it's almost 2 decades. And when you think about the American politics and compare it with American politics, let me remind you, it was George W. Bush who was in the White House at the time Erdogan became the prime minister. So George W. Bush had 2 terms, and then Barack Obama had 2 terms, and Donald Trump served another term, and Joe Biden is in his first term. So there were 4 American presidents serving in the United States, and during that time, Erdogan was actually the head of the executive for about 20 years. So that's quite a lot of time when you think about a country and power that you can actually exercise over 20 years. Erdogan had a significant imprint over Turkish politics in these 20 years. Okay, so the question is, how has Erdogan subverted democracy, right? So I already claimed that elected officials play an important role in undermining democratic politics. So Erdogan actually played an important role in undermining and subverting democracy in the country. So there are 3 things that we need to underline here. Number 1, civil liberties and the media, checks and balances in the system, and also electoral manipulation. I will be going over each and every one of these and try to explain how Erdogan actually and his party subverted all 3 pillars of democracy. Number 1, civil liberties. So civil liberties, especially for democracy, you need to establish freedom of information, expression, and association and assembly for a democracy to be a viable democracy. Without freedom of information, freedom of the media, freedom of expression and association, it is very unlikely for a democracy to remain a viable democracy, because the citizens need to have access to these sources of information and exercise their freedom of expression and association to be able to participate in politics and also make informed decisions in elections and hold their elected officials accountable. So freedom of information was a very important target for Erdogan and his party. And it is very safe to say now that 90% of public and private media is controlled by his government. So this picture is actually kind of, quite telling. In this, you see 8 Turkish daily newspapers, and you don't need to speak Turkish to understand what's going on here. You can take a look at the headlines. You can see that the headlines is pretty much kind of, talking about the same thing, right? So this tells us or shows us how centralized media coverage has become. And all of these are, by the way, private newspapers. They are not public newspapers. They're all private newspapers. And the news coverage has become so centralized and very much pro-government over the years. And Erdogan has been doing this in a very systematic fashion, controlling significant part of Turkish media, public and private alike. And you can ask the question, okay, how is that even possible? How can a prime minister coming to power undermine media so much and control an entire media landscape? So this is what he did. As the prime minister, of course, he had significant control over state bureaucracy. He also politicized state bureaucracy to the extent that he started using tax authorities, for example, to fine and intimidate big companies, including media corporations. So this is not unique to Erdogan at all, not unique to Turkey at all. You actually have very similar experiences in many different countries. Hungary is a very good example. Under Viktor Orban, Fidesz have been undermining media freedoms using tax authorities to intimidate big companies. So big media corporations were subject to tax audits and especially when they were actually covering maybe corruption stories about the government and pretty much trying to hold the government accountable for wrongdoings, they were pretty much fined and penalized using state authorities, in this case, tax authorities. So one key example would be Doğan Media Company. They were given in 2009 for covering anti-government or critical stories about the government, $3 billion in tax fines. So $3 billion in tax fines would basically force the company to go bankrupt because they were not that of a big, corporation. So they ended up negotiating with the government to reduce the tax fine, to revise the tax fine, and they ended up selling several network stations that were part of the media corporation conglomerate and newspapers to pro-government businesses. So basically, Erdogan broke down the existing media corporations and forced the owners of these media corporations to share their pie, their share with pro-government people. And of course, this relationship not only force these people to sell their newspapers and network stations to government-friendly owners, but it also kind of spread self-censorship. So it was very clear that the government was ready to penalize in all those people who were working in the media and who owned media corporations if they actually criticized the government. So many of these measures actually pushed or sent a very clear message of self-censorship to journalists, columnists, and media owners. And that was one particular way of silencing the media. Then we also have another way in which Erdogan actually used the courts in this instance to impose media blackouts, especially when there's a crisis in the country. So in the past 10, 12 years, whenever there was a huge problem like a terrorist attack or a major wrongdoing by the government, there would be a media blackout over that particular story. So there would be no coverage of that incident at all. And whoever wanted to cover those stories, they would be taken to the courts and they would be given sentences, sometimes, fines, sometimes prison sentences for violating media blackout and court order. That's the conventional media, newspapers and network stations, but we also have a similar problem with social media. So when Turkish citizens wanted to find, or recover their access to information, they went ahead and started using social media more and more intensely. And they used Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and other social media venues. And when the government realized that social media was actually a menace, as Erdogan called it, they started to impose certain bans, sometimes blanket bans, sometimes kind of, restricting content over Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and even Wikipedia. So some of these outlets were banned for months between 2013 and 2018. Now we see content restrictions playing much more important role rather than blanket ban over any of these sites. Okay, so that's the media aspect. But what about freedom of expression? So freedom of expression and freedom of media are very much intertwined, but that's very much about journalists, columnists, and those people who actually work in the media. But ordinary citizens were not untouched either. So if you were an ordinary citizen, an individual who were tweeting about the government and pretty much criticizing the government, it was very likely that you would actually be taken to the court because you're criticizing the government. So in Turkish penal code, there is a defamation code or article that actually penalizes defaming the president. And of course, because this is kind of, quite vague, what do you mean by defaming the president? It's very much kind of, open to interpretation. And pro-government judges sitting in courts, they basically kind of, hold people accountable for criticizing the president and defaming the president. So you can see the number of investigations that were open and criminal cases that were open as a result of those investigations over time. So there are 6 presidents here in this chart, from Kenan Evren to Tayyip Erdogan, and the number of investigations and criminal cases that were filed by these presidents after elected as presidents. So Tayyip Erdogan actually filed about 160,000 investigations against Turkish citizens, and 38,000 of them turned into criminal cases in the courts. 1,100 were kids, and out of that 38,000, 3,500 received prison sentences for defaming the president, and 10 of them were actually underage. They were minors. So freedom of expression, this is just an example of how it was undermined, and a very widespread practice for the government. Okay. So this is not the entire story. The government also restricts freedom of assembly and association. There were very critical examples. I'm not sure if you followed the news at the time. This picture actually is from Gezi Park protests, where you actually had the riot police basically punishing the protesters, peaceful protesters on site. So what was the protest about? They were actually about a public park, downtown park in Istanbul. If you've been to Istanbul, this is the Taksim Square. So in Taksim Square, there's a beautiful, but kind of, mid-sized park. And the government decided to destroy the park and replace it with a shopping mall. And many people who actually kind of, were interested in urban planning and wanted to keep a green space in otherwise a gray Istanbul, they wanted to defend the park. So they set tents and they started peaceful activism in the park to defend the park from destruction. And over the course of these events, we see the riot police in the very early days of the protests and sit-in, basically using disproportionate force against peaceful protesters. That basically frustrated thousands and thousands of citizens who wanted to show solidarity with these, small group of protesters. So they showed up, and it was a huge mobilization as thousands and thousands of people actually started to join the protests, first in Istanbul and in the rest of the country. The police continued with a crackdown, and several of the protesters were killed, first through riot police deliberate targeting of the protesters with tear gas canisters and rubber bullets, and thousands were injured along the way, and many of them actually lost their eyes and were partially blinded. Interestingly, or maybe not so interestingly, there was no media coverage of this unprecedented mobilization of Turkish people in the streets against the government action. Many people who wanted to know what was going on in downtown Istanbul and other cities, they actually tuned into CNN International and follow news over Twitter because there was no media coverage of these protests in Turkish media. And despite that crackdown, heavy crackdown by the police over the protesters, the government did not let the protesters go. Civil society organizations that joined the protesters and organized the protesters, they were taken to the court with facing terrorism charges and for conspiring to overthrow the government, Turkish government. There's still an ongoing court case. Here, this gentleman, Osman Kavala, is a prominent businessman and a philanthropist, and he has been a very important financier of civil society organizations and associations in Turkey for several years. And the government basically connected him to the Gezi Park protests, and he's actually in prison for more than 4 years now without a conviction, and he's waiting his conviction and practically in prison for more than 4 years. I'm sure you have maybe heard about him or read some stories about him in newspapers. Okay, so you can ask the question, okay, how is this possible? So the government is undermining civil liberties, freedom of the media, freedom of assembly, association, and expression. You can see that there's significant support coming from the state establishment. The courts and the bureaucracy is basically helping Erdogan to accomplish this. And without their support, it's impossible for him to undermine any of these liberties. So that's exactly what we need to understand when we talk about checks and balances. So the existing system in Turkey was very much kind of, the higher courts and the judicial council was to a great extent independent of Turkish elected officials. So Erdogan, when he came to power in 2003, he complained about how the courts basically made his job a lot harder. So with his, of course, partners among the bureaucracy, especially the Gülen movement, we see them playing an important role, first infiltrating the judicial system and later restructuring the entire judicial system in the country through a referendum, a constitutional referendum in 2010. So this referendum basically changed the constitution, so the higher courts were restructured and the judicial council that is responsible for the disciplinary actions of judges and prosecutors and their appointments were restructured. So that entire restructuring led to extensive court packing and politicization of the judiciary. Of course, this is the judicial branch. We can also say, claim the same for the rest of the state establishment. So tax authorities and the police and every other part of the state were also politicized through appointments that were made by the government. And remember, we're talking about 20 years of the same party ruling the country. Maybe this is inevitable when you have so much power given to a single party for so much time. So that's the very first important attempt to undermine checks and balances in the system. Another important event happened in 2017 with another constitutional referendum, this time replacing the parliamentary system with the presidential system. So what's going on? In 2010, it was the judicial branch that was basically sidelined. In 2017, it was the legislative branch. The parliament was completely sidelined. So now the executive is basically holding all the power in its hands because the existing presidential system that was passed in 2017 is very much a centralized system where you have every single decision, almost every single decision made by the president, and very limited checks over his powers. So the parliament cannot hold him accountable on a number of respects. They don't even have the power to ratify his appointments to the cabinet. So if Erdogan, the president now, wants to appoint a cabinet member, a minister, or his own vice presidents, the parliament does not have any say over those appointments, and they cannot hold them accountable if they see any kind of wrongdoing. So president is basically ruling by decree since 2018, the very first presidential election that happened after the constitution was changed. So that is the second part of this process. And the third and the final part that I want to talk about today, electoral manipulation. So this is a kind of an interesting and tricky concept because there is no electoral fraud in Turkey. So Erdogan and his party, they're not stealing elections on the election day. They're not rigging elections on the election day. And indeed, as many observers actually kind of right now know from the study of democratic backsliding all around the world, not just Turkey, only amateurs steal elections on the election day. So indeed, I have monitored multiple elections in Turkey from 2014 to 2019. And in all of those elections, they were very clear, very regular, very well-managed, elections. So this picture is coming from a school, a ballot box in Turkey. You can see even the ballot box is actually transparent. There is significant transparency in elections on the election day. So I'm putting emphasis on the election day. There's a reason. So elections are not rigged, but they're not free or fair either. And that is the reason we talk about electoral manipulation, many of electoral manipulation that is not about electoral fraud. So what is this then? This is about actually rigging the game itself rather than rigging the election on the election day. So what do we mean by that? Imagine democracy as a soccer game or a football game. You have a field where you have two kind of teams trying to win the game, right? And the field is an even playing field for all teams. So you have regular rules, you have established rules, and a referee and multiple referees perhaps trying to keep the game as fair as possible. In this particular instance, however, in Turkey and in many different countries, we actually see the elected officials coming in and tilting the playing field in their favor. So they're basically resorting to number of measures that keep the game quite unfair for their rivals. So the incumbent party is basically using its authority and resources and access to the state to undermine the fairness of the game. So how do they do that? Access to media plays a very important role. I already told you that 90% of Turkish media is under Erdogan's control. And whenever there's a kind of, a critical moment for the government, the media turns a blind eye. So the people don't know what's going on unless they actually use Twitter in an active fashion. And then we have, public resources at the disposal of the government. So all civil servants at their disposal, all public resources at their disposal, financial and otherwise. So the government can basically use these resources at their disposal in their own favor and at the expense of the opposition. So now the playing field is no longer fair. It's very much uneven. And the opposition has to fight a really, really kind of, hard to win the elections. That takes me to a very important note. So yes, Turkish democracy is not functioning well. There are a lot of problems and it's increasingly becoming autocratic, but elections are still competitive. It's still real. So yes, the playing field is no longer even, it's very much uneven, but it is very possible, still possible for the opposition to win the elections if they fight hard enough. If they run twice as fast and twice as much, perhaps, then it is possible for them to win the elections. And here, it's good that the opposition parties keep participating in elections. They do not lose hope. They remain in the game. And they do not leave the field. And the people, Turkish citizens actually do not leave the game either. They know that this is not a fair game, but they're happy to participate. So over the last 10 years or so, voter turnout has been quite high. 80 to 85% of the Turkish citizens have been showing up consistently on the election day to cast their votes for whatever party they support. So that's the good news, despite, all the bad that's happening. Okay, so I already told you that all of this is impossible if there is no popular support. Even if you manipulate elections, you still need popular support to win the elections. And that's exactly what the AKP did over the past 20 years. So multiple general elections, 2002, 7, 11, 15, and finally the presidential elections in 2018 handed power to the AKP, executive power to the AKP. Similarly, local elections in 2004, 9, and 14 actually handed power to the AKP at the local level. And I already emphasized the fact that in two major referenda in 2010 and 2017, the AKP and Erdogan in particular managed to change the system in constitutional referendum. Without popular support, you cannot do any of this. So in a nutshell, people basically gave the power to the party, the ruling party, AKP, and Erdogan in particular, to redesign the entire system. And they allowed him to reform the judiciary, instate the presidential system, and also at the same time undermine democratic politics. And it was very much kind of obvious that democracy was retreating and backsliding in the country, but they still kept supporting the party. And you can ask, why? That's the key question here, right? I want to emphasize and underline two factors here. Number one, economic factors, and number two, ideological factors. So economic factors are really important because yes, Turkey is a middle income country, but it also has a very sizable low income part of the society. So low income families actually make a big part of party's support base, and they benefited so much from the services and policies that the party enacted over the years. I'm talking about 20 years, right? So as soon as the party came to power, we see Turkish economy booming and inflation decreasing to single-digit numbers, unemployment increasing, and people actually having access to cheap credit through the banks. So all of this actually kind of generated a very important sense of enrichment and increasing wealth, especially for lower income families, again, which makes a big part of government support base. So that's not the only story. So macroeconomic policies and performance of the government was quite good, at least until recently. So these people were happy with the government, so they kept supporting it. But the government also paid specific attention to social assistance and welfare programs. Some of them was quite particularistic, very much kind of, helping their own support base in key locations, but also pretty much kind of, helping every lower income family through more universalistic policies like welfare programs. Healthcare system in particular played a very important role, especially for those people who did not have private insurance, who had to use public insurance. They have observed substantial improvement in public health services. So over the 20 years, many lower income families, when they talk about the current government and what they gained from AKP's governance, they talk about that healthcare system over and over again, as well as their economic well-being pretty much improved over the years. That's not the only factor. I also want to emphasize ideological factors here. So Erdogan is a political genius. He is a very charismatic leader. He's a very good public speaker, and he can actually kind of, frame certain issues in Turkish politics in a brilliant fashion to consolidate his support base and polarize the society along certain lines. The way he polarizes society is actually taking a populist Islamist framework, and he uses religious sensibilities, religious references to Islam, and pretty much kind of, cater to people's Islamic values and sensibilities to create that support base and polarize the society along conservative lines. So his support base is true Muslims, and they're truly conservative people. They actually are truly national and also local and authentic. And the opposition is basically kind of strangers to the nation. They do not belong to the traditions of the nation, and they do not necessarily follow the real Turkish Islamic sensibilities. So he creates that polarized environment and consolidates his support base around populist Islamist elements. And he, of course, relying on the economic performance that he achieved over the years, can actually keep power pretty much intact. But you can, if you're following news, especially coming from Turkey, particularly the story about Turkish currency depreciating rapidly over the years, over the months, actually, not even years, you know that Turkish economy is in a deep trouble. Since 2018, I would say, but this graph actually kind of puts it much earlier than 2018. Since 2013, Turkish economy is in a decline mode. So yes, the government did an amazing job after coming to power in 2002. You can see it here. This is GDP per capita in current US dollars. Turkish economy did amazingly well over the years from 2002 to 2013. And of course, Turkish people actually felt that increasing wealth in their own everyday experiences, as I told you in a minute in the previous slide. So that's not the case any longer, especially since 2018. Turkish economy is in crisis mode. Inflation is rising once again. It's about 45% now. And that's a conservative estimate that is released by the government, official number. And Turkish currency has lost its value substantially over the last year. And with all of that, Turkish people has been losing their purchasing power. They cannot afford the things that they used to afford under AKP government in the past. So they cannot pay their utility bills. They cannot buy even food, let alone other luxuries, and they cannot go on vacations. They cannot even pay their rents. So the inflation rate, along with the depreciating Turkish lira, has actually created significant impoverishment in the country for all parts of the society, perhaps with the exception of very rich. So lower income families and middle income families have been going through significant impoverishment over several months now. And of course, COVID made everything much worse. So what about the opposition? What does the opposition do? In the face of all of this democratic crisis and economic crisis, the opposition parties decided to come together and form a pro-democracy alliance. They understand that what's going on in Turkey is really kind of more important than any single party and their prospect for coming to power and through elections. So these 6 leaders that you can see in this picture came together and formed an alliance very recently. Some of these leaders have been working together since 2017, and they worked together in 2019 local elections as well. That was fruitful for them. And in many of these local elections in big cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Adana, the opposition candidates actually won over the AKP candidates. So next year, 2023, is a very critical year because that's when the presidential elections will take place. So all these 6 leaders and many other leaders as well in the opposition, they're trying to form a strategy to defeat Erdogan in 2023 and put Turkey back on the path of democracy and economic recovery. That is the idea. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The polls are actually kind of showing significant decline, especially for the ruling party, AKP here, and the opposition parties are actually making some advances, although limited. And this is the largest group, almost the 3rd largest group in the country, those who are undecided or who do not want to vote in the elections or who want to cast a protest vote. So Turkish people are disillusioned, they're unhappy, but they're not ready to join the ranks of the opposition either. So we're talking about 20% of those people who are kind of skeptical. They don't want to vote for the ruling party, but they're not ready to vote for the opposition either. Okay. So in conclusion, elected officials now undermine democracy. They come to power in free and fair elections, and they use legal tools to undermine democratic politics. This is happening very incrementally. So attacks on the media, partisan appointments and checks and balances, erosion of checks and balances, and electoral manipulation that may actually come in many different forms and shapes, like gerrymandering, voter ID laws, voter registration processes, and access to resources are a kind of a huge menu of manipulation for elected officials. So we need to be really cognizant of this incrementalism and the fact that democracies do not die rapidly or abruptly, and they do not die thanks to fascist parties, or they don't die thanks to military officials. They're actually very much undermined by elected officials, the people that we elect to power. And we need to be really careful when they attack the media, they resort to partisan appointments, court packing, or undermining checks and balances, and they resort to electoral manipulation. We need to be really careful, and we need to kind of act fast, because if we wait, because this is such an incremental process, if we wait, it may be too late for us to save and salvage democracy. So how do we save democracy? Given the heightened polarization, not just in Turkey, but in many different countries where elected officials undermine democracy, we actually need a uniting discourse and further engagement rather than polarization. Engaging with the other, whoever that other is very important. And of course, finally, economy matters. So if you have problems, economic crisis and economic, even kind of, concerns, or even economic recovery that actually certain groups in the society benefit, it can help these elected officials to come to power, remain in power, and undermine democratic institutions. Okay, that's all I have to say. I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Great, thank you so much. So if you have question, please type it in the chat box. But I also think we can manage to ask your questions. So I'll ask Steve, you have your hand up. If you would unmute, we're perfect.
That was really a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for enlightening us on the Turkish situation and putting it in the broader context of the threats to democracy kind of across the world. I've got a whole bunch of questions, and but I want to ask two in particular. One is, I had written down among the questions I wanted to ask, will inflation bring Erdogan down? I think you've addressed that question, and of course you don't know, and none of us knows, but it surely weakens him. But the question that really is at the heart of what I want to ask is, you showed very clearly how people using democratic processes and in playing by the rules can take power and then subvert those rules and move beyond what the norms of the system typically predict. And what I'd like you to talk about is whether the Turkish system is still sufficiently open. The electoral system is still sufficiently robust, as you've described it, so that a unified opposition really does have a chance to defeat him. Because it seems to me that you're describing something that looks very much like the machine politics of the United States in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century, and not as much like the authoritarian regimes in which people, leaders take such complete control that electoral defeat is an impossibility. And if you would talk about that and the prospects for 2023, I'd really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for these excellent questions. So there is a concept that we use in political science to describe these regimes. We call them competitive authoritarian. So they're both competitive and authoritarian at the same time, unlike these, autocratic regimes that we're much more familiar with. They have robust elections that keep them in power. So that makes them competitive. But they're also authoritarian because the state is very much kind of under the control of the ruling party, and the playing field is no longer fair. So that brings us to the question, what's going to happen in 2023, or when Erdogan is really weakened because of higher inflation and higher unemployment and declining economic prospects for the country. So there is very clear indication in the polls that he's been losing people's confidence, but it's not certain that he will lose the elections for a number of reasons. Number one, people may still give him a chance, and it may be a genuine victory for him, even if he did not actually rig the game on the election day. So what does that mean? Ruling for 20 years, especially with a very good performance in the first 12, 13 years, it actually cultivates a very strong bond between Erdogan and the people, especially lower income families with conservative attitudes. So I think at least maybe 30-35% of his support base is not ready to abandon him. They have strong loyalty to the leader, and they feel like whatever and this is what I've observed in my field, so I'm not necessarily kind of making this up. So when I talk to lower income families, they tell me over and over again, I actually kind of got richer thanks to Erdogan after he came to power. So myself and my family, we actually are wealthier because of him. So there is a very strong sense of loyalty to Erdogan, because they still know that, yes, this is maybe kind of a moment that they do not necessarily feel as prosperous, but and they are facing high levels of inflation. But some people at least still think that Erdogan is the one who's going to fix it, because he fixed it before, and he can still fix it. So a 30-35% of the people, Turkish people, are still confident that Erdogan can actually fix this for them. And this is just a hiccup, like, a phase of sorts, and it's going to just kind of, become much, much better. So there we actually genuine support for him pretty much sustained. And then we have the electoral system itself. So Erdogan, when the AKP lost major cities in the country, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and Adana, I told you about in this presentation, he did a number of things. Number one, he was really, really unhappy that he lost Istanbul in particular, because Istanbul is so important for him. He was the mayor of the city, and that's how he actually kind of, became the leader of the country after serving as the mayor. And he believes that whoever wins Istanbul will win the country. So next elections, it's very likely that the opposition will actually kind of, be a very important contender. So he wants to stop that. But what did he do? So on the night of the elections, he put a lot of pressure on the Electoral Council to cancel the elections for Istanbul in particular. So that's where you actually kind of, politicization of the judiciary and the state coming in and pretty much kind of undermining the robustness of the electoral system, right? So if the Electoral Council is actually beholden to the government, then whatever the government wants actually determines the electoral results. So here's the problem, because Erdogan actually tried that for Istanbul election, because the opposition was very much organized, they counted every single vote in a parallel count, and they contested the Electoral Council's records very solidly, very kind of, significantly. So the council at the end of the day could not declare a victory for AKP's candidate, but they canceled the election still for no reason. It's very kind of, still it doesn't make any sense. They made some reason up, and they said, okay, this was not a, or a regular election, or a kind of, an election that was actually in compliance with the rules. We are calling for a repeat election. And in the repeat election, many more people showed up at the ballot box, and they voted for the opposition candidate. So the opposition candidate had to win the same election twice. So that actually tells us the electoral competition is getting more and more unfair as Erdogan actually kind of, faces defeat at the ballot box. So 2023 is very, very uncertain. We really don't know what's going to happen in 2023. There are a number of factors that we need to consider. Number one, it's very clear that Erdogan will put a lot of pressure over Electoral Council to rule in favor of him and his party. We know that for sure. Number two, that means the opposition should be very vigilant and very well organized, as they were in the case of Istanbul, for the entire country, which is a humongous task. It's almost very impossible for them to do the same thing for the entire country. Istanbul is the most urban place, center of the country. So how can you replicate the same thing for the rest of the country with every single village and town? That's a huge problem ahead of the opposition. And of course, if it's a close race, as it was in the very first time for Istanbul, then it's going to be very clear that Erdogan will try to steal that election, right? So the opposition should actually make sure that they have a very wide margin of victory. So it's not going to be like 49%, 51% in favor of the opposition. That's very, very likely for Erdogan to kind of steal the elections on the election day, using his power and presence all over the country and the state resources. So what does the opposition need to do then? They need to win it by a wide margin, like 5%, 4%, 6%, whatever, so that it's very clear victory for the opposition and not a possibility for Erdogan to steal the election or call for a repeat election like he did in the case of Istanbul. So the system is still robust and open, but it is also very much open to abuse. especially under certain circumstances that I try to specify now, it is very likely that the system will lose its competitiveness altogether. It's not going to be competitive at all. And Erdogan can just, grab power. And then the country is no longer competitive authoritarian, it is outright authoritarian, if that makes sense. So that 2023 election is a very important turning point, a critical juncture of sorts. So depending on the opposition, the people's choices, and what Erdogan and the security establishment will do, anything is possible at this point.
Sounds like this country, a democracy is alive, but in trouble.
Yep, absolutely. So it is still very possible for the opposition to win the election, but they need to work really, really, really hard.
We have a question in the chat. How did major urban centers vote on constitutional reforms in 10 and 17?
That's a very good question. In both of those referendum, major urban centers voted in favor of both of these constitutional changes. So both Istanbul and Ankara, except for Izmir, which is always an opposition stronghold, they voted in favor of these constitutional changes until 2019 elections. So local elections in 2019 was an important turning point. For the first time, we see Istanbul practically changing sides and starting voting for the opposition instead of the party, the ruling party. So that was a very important turning point, and that's also a very important concern for Erdogan. That's why he called for a repeat election. I think that answers your question. The second question, did Erdogan go to college? We don't know. Right? We really don't know. I'm reading it. This is a big topic of conversation and controversy in Turkey. So by constitutional, rules, the president should actually be a college graduate. So to be an eligible candidate, you have to be a college graduate. We don't know if Erdogan is one. This is a very good example of how he actually uses state power and media power to just, get away with rules and regulations. So it's very likely that his presidency since 2014 is very unconstitutional. And there's nothing we can do about it because the courts are working in his favor. The media is not covering the story as it should. And the people do not have access to information. I'm reading a book written by a journalist who's quite critical of the government. And this journalist has done some significant archival work and digging through the material. And he found out that the college Erdogan allegedly graduated from did not exist at the time he graduated. So in 1981, he claims to graduated from college, and that institution was established in 1982. So this is a lie, right? Outright blatant lie, and there's nothing we can do about it. So people are just kind of talking about, okay, you're not a college graduate. How can you run for presidency? Doesn't matter. And then he actually makes up a story. They released a kind of diploma that was pretty much designed and printed much later. It was not original. Nobody knows him as a kind of college friend. No one came up and said, yeah, of course, we attended the same college. No story of that sort. And this journalist found out that all the reports and records that predated 1982, they were all burned, in a fire, very conveniently so. So this is the story of his graduation from college. But this is a very good example of how he can actually bend the rules, go around these rules, and just kind of rig the system because he has so much power in the media, so much power in the courts.
Okay, another question. How much of current economic downturn is due to COVID and how much to general bad management?
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's really hard to disentangle the two. But the troubles actually started before COVID. So 2018, when he was elected the president in 2018, the entire economic governance, management of the economy basically was given to Erdogan, his hands. No prime minister and his cabinet, no ministers and their aides. The entire decision-making process was given to him. Since then, he fired multiple central bank directors. He hired several different, new people to sit in that particular seat, central bank directors, and also kind of several new ministers of finance and economy. So he's basically kind of, switching and coming up with new ideas every month or so, trying to fix the economy, but it's no longer salvageable. And the reason is people do not have trust and confidence in Turkish economy any longer. So the country, as it becomes more and more autocratic, and everything is basically decided by a single individual, one man, businesses do not want to stay in the country because they know the courts do not function well. The rule of law is no more. And official statistics do not reflect the real numbers. And the country is in trouble, basically. And there is no prospects for Erdogan to lose power. It's likely that he's not going to give away power so easily. So trust is very important. Confidence is very important for producers and consumers alike. And the people have been losing that confidence in his ability to govern the country, his performance overall, democratic institutions in the country, and rule of law. So when you have all of these problems, it's very hard for a government to kind of keep things on track. And on top of that, Erdogan is making all these mistakes, firing central bank directors, hiring new ministers of finance. Actually, until very recently, his son-in-law was the minister of finance. And when you have, your family member rather than a decent person that deserves to actually occupy that seat, people do not trust you any longer, especially those who are actually calling the shots in the economy. So, and on top of that, this was happening since 2018, you have COVID. Early days of COVID was okay, somewhat okay for Turkish health system, but quickly lockdowns and other restrictions over economic activity, especially for shopkeepers, local shopkeepers, turned out to be quite troublesome. And then we have a kind of, a pretty much spiraling down the economic crisis that was already in place. So it's both COVID and bad management, very much kind of, in an explosive fashion, undermining economic prospects for Turkey. Oh, yeah.
What was the recent military coup all about? Was it a pro-democracy coup attempt?
That's a very good question. I did not have time to talk about it. So in summer 2016, there was a coup attempt by one part of the Turkish armed forces. So this is very unlike what happened before in Turkish history. So not 1960, 1980, but this is a very different type of military intervention. And the reason why I'm saying that is the people, the armed forces who actually staged the coup attempt were former allies to Erdogan. So Erdogan, after coming to power, he realized the state bureaucracy was not going to work with him. So in order to capture and colonize the state, he made an alliance with another religious network whose leader, Fethullah Gülen, is actually residing in the United States since 2000, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. So this religious network was very much eager not to capture power through elections, as Erdogan did, but they wanted to kind of infiltrate the state bureaucracy, the police forces, the armed forces, the judicial branch, and the Ministry of Education and the school network. So they have been working on this for several decades, and especially in the Cold War context, that was quite easy for them to do, because Turkey, being a NATO member and being very much kind of anti-communist and Soviet Union, very much in line with American foreign policy at the time, there was a desire to revive Islamic networks as a counterbalance to the rising left-wing movements in multiple countries. So Turkey was one of those countries where Islamic networks and religious groups were seen as a savior, or a kind of, force to stop spread of leftist ideology among the youth in particular. So this network, this religious network, was kind of given support by the state authorities to build networks among the youth and recruit people from different parts of the society, especially lower income families. So they were in quite important force in the country when AKP came to power. As soon as the AKP came to power, a couple of years later, they actually, the two forces, two religious groups, networks, made a alliance of sorts. They had a marriage of convenience where the AKP would actually hold power in the government. Erdogan would be the leader of the country. And this network, using its cadres and people in state bureaucracy, would help him take over the state machinery. So that worked quite well for a couple of years until the two forces started to fight with each other for more power. So we still don't know what happened behind closed doors. Hopefully we will find out in years to come. And these two forces, religious network that was led by Fethullah Gülen and AKP under Erdogan's leadership, they started to fight with each other over the state control of the state and state bureaucracy. So the coup attempt was actually one link in that long chain of conflict. And that was the final link, I would say, because after the coup attempt that failed, thanks to the people's vigilance and support for the government, along with the opposition parties, because they were like, no, we don't want a military intervention. We just want to go back to democracy. We want, freedoms and civil rights and liberties and real and fair free elections. We don't want a military intervention to salvage democracy, if that was the intention. I'd say that was not the intention. Maybe that was the excuse on the part of the Gülen network, but the real goal was to get rid of Erdogan and capture the state for themselves, because they were fighting over the control of the state with Erdogan. So what happened? They failed. They could not go ahead with the coup. They could not take over power, and they could not get rid of Erdogan. Erdogan prevailed. And as soon as he prevailed, he basically decimated the entire network, the religious network that was present in the country, and put significant pressure over the rest of the network in multiple countries in the world. So that was a huge crackdown on the movement, along with other opposition forces. Thousands of people were fired from state bureaucracy. Hundreds of them were imprisoned. Several of them were subject to torture and inhumane conditions, and they're still in jail. That's a huge problem for Turkish democracy. And this is going to be a main problem for the opposition. They need to address this question, issue if they win the elections, and they need to find a way to recover from this crackdown, address the problems of these people, and really kind of have a decent judicial process for them if they're culprits, if they're culpable, if they participated in this coup attempt. They should be, of course, kind of penalized, but in a kind of system where rule of law prevails rather than political issues and political concerns actually penalize these people because they belong to a network.
There's another question. Erdogan's base is rural and Eastern, yet he is a product of Istanbul. How did he manage to become the champion of the rural, poor, and Islamic fundamentalists?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And there's a lot written on this topic. I don't know if I can do justice to that entire literature, but let me try to be brief and concise. So if you ask me, many of the problems that we're talking today with respect to Turkish politics and democracy are actually coming from the fact that immigration in the country were not properly managed. What do I mean by that? So 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we see enormous immigration coming from rural towns and areas, villages from Turkey, to major cities. So we're talking about hundreds of and thousands of families here. And when they arrived in the big cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Adana, and elsewhere, they really did not have any way of integration and urbanization in the new environment that they were living in. So what they ended up doing, they created their new or recreated their village life on the outskirts of major cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Adana, and other cities. So the big chunk of these major cities are actually born in a rural area. So I don't know the statistics, but like, my family, for example, my mom is from Istanbul. She was born and raised in Istanbul. My father was not. And it's very likely that you will have millions of Istanbulites whose parents were not born in Istanbul. So that means there's a big part of Istanbul's population is actually coming from rural Turkey. So this entire process was not managed well because the municipalities and the central government was not ready to address the problems of these people who were coming in huge numbers into these big cities. They were not given proper infrastructure. They were not provided networks and decent living conditions to welcome them to the cities, no proper housing, no proper jobs. Many of them ended up being street vendors. So there was a kind of huge transition from rural life to urban life, but their new lives were not urban either. They were neither urban nor rural. So what happened is, at that particular juncture, as all these families were trying to go through this transition, 1970s and 1980s, it was only the Islamist parties that extended a hand to these newcomers. They were very much cognizant of the fact that these people needed support, they needed help, and the best way to help them was actually local municipalities. So it was not a coincidence that Erdogan was elected the mayor of Istanbul in 1994. Indeed, the ascendance of the Islamist party started back in late 1980s, 1989. Local elections, the very first local elections, when the Islamist parties had a huge showing, especially in these neighborhoods and towns where there were a huge number of recent immigrants coming to Istanbul, Ankara, and other major cities. So they formed the basis, the most significant electoral basis for the Islamist parties starting in the 1980s. And Erdogan is basically kind of riding on that tide. And during his municipality, mayorship in Istanbul municipality, he served so well to these constituencies. He really cared for them. He collected their trash. He provided water. He built new infrastructure for clean water. And he delivered all these services, very important services for lower income families. So you can understand that it's not a recent story for them. It's been 25 years, especially for Istanbul lower income families, that they have this love relationship with Erdogan. They really admire him because he has been the one who really cared for their needs and catered to their needs, at least until very recently with the economic downturn. So I hope that answers your question. This is, of course, kind of, one part of the story, especially when it comes to material incentives and the fact that these families had nothing to rely on other than these Islamic networks and Islamic municipalities. That's pretty much kind of, part of the story. And of course, you can also perhaps speculate that these people are coming from conservative rural areas and they're intimidated by metropolitan life, urban lifestyles. And they kind of, hold on to their values because they really do not want to kind of, lose their values that they cherish so much in their villages and their small towns. So when they come in, they really appreciate the fact that there's an Islamic network or a party that share the same language, same culture, same practices with them, and are willing to serve their needs. So it's not just material incentives, but also more ideational and ideological incentives that kind of, keep these people together. I hope that makes sense.
Are the wealthy urban Istanbulites leaving the country?
That's a very real problem right now in the country. So I wouldn't say particularly the wealthy, but this is much larger than the wealthy Istanbulites. We're talking about educated, middle class, urban, especially middle-aged and youth. So whoever can actually have an exit ticket, they leave the country. So now we have an exodus, of course, of doctors, for example, especially with the mismanagement of COVID and the fact that government is not giving any kind of support to the healthcare professionals. All these doctors are basically learning German. This is a big thing for Turkish doctors now. They're learning German because German health system allows for foreign doctors to come and practice in Germany. So all of these courses, German courses, are flooded by doctors who want to leave the country. That's the very, very big problem for Turkey, because Turkey, unlike many other Middle Eastern countries, have a very strong educated workforce. We have a very solid education system, used to have at least, and middle-class professionals are really good at their jobs. And those people who have the capital, human capital, that can actually they can rely on abroad, they're taking that human capital with them and they're leaving the country. And this is the case since 2016. It started much before COVID. So when the country took a very harsh authoritarian turn with the coup attempt and its aftermath, many people were like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to live in this country any longer. I want to go. I had several friends. I came to the United States in 2014. So it was like, with his election as the president, it had nothing to do with him. But I had many, many friends leaving the country and coming to the United States and going to different parts of Europe to work and to build a new life with their families in particular, especially those people who have kids are very, very concerned for the future of their kids because the country that they know does not exist any longer. And they want to provide a decent life for their kids. So they try to find options abroad. And most recently, there was a New York Times article, I don't know if you have seen it, covering the story of doctors, Turkish doctors leaving the country. This is a big problem because all the people that we have actually educated over the years, we're losing their capital, and the Turkish health system will just collapse if the trend continues.
How is the health of President Erdogan? He doesn't look healthy when in the pictures. And there are a number of speculations that he may not make it the next election.
Well, again, very much like his college degree, this is also speculation. This is the authoritarian part of the country, right? So because there is no freedom of information and transparency in government, we really do not know how well he is doing health-wise. And this is really, concerning because if he's not in good shape, if he cannot actually make, right decisions and his mind is not in a good place to make those decisions, then we're in trouble because the 2017 constitutional referendum and the elections in 2018, as I said, gave all the power in the country to him. He is the only person who actually can decide on a number of things. And he's the one who holds all that power, the authoritarian part of the regime, right? So if he's not in good shape, then the country is not in good shape because we have given him so much power. So there are all these speculations about his health. He doesn't look good, right? The picture that I showed you, he's a very old picture. So recent pictures show him really kind of, torn down, and he looks really tired and exhausted. And of course, he has so much kind of, makeup on him to keep him vibrant and look good. But we really don't know. There are all these speculations and rumors about him not doing well health-wise. He's been sick for so many years now. He's got cancer, and then he had multiple surgeries. That's what we know. But he also has other health problems, more chronic problems. We don't know much about them either. So there are a lot of things that we don't know. There are some rumors, again, as you said, that he may not run in the next elections, 2023. That's possible. he may actually say that I'm not, up for it any longer. Health-wise, I have health problems, and he may step down in favor of someone who he can control. But that will undermine the prospects of his party getting re-elected significantly, because the connection that Erdogan has with the people, especially urban poor, lower income families, that does not exist with any other leader in the party. So Erdogan is the only person that can actually kind of, keep the hearts and minds of the people, at least maybe 35% of the people who are still ready to vote for him. So I'm sorry, I couldn't answer your question because we don't know.
Looks like Derek has a question, and that'll be the last question.
I would like to make first a comment and then a short question. In their excellent book by the two Harvard professors, Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, they go through the whole scenario. What you have done this evening is given us an excellent illustration of how that book applies in the instances of a particular country, namely Turkey. And Levitsky and Ziblatt said that democracy's survival depends on two particular guardrails, mutual tolerance and institutional forbearance. And you've illustrated to us excellently how that mutual tolerance has not been carried out, and how in the institutions there's not been forbearance about the institutions. So I want to congratulate you and thank you very much for that. My brief question is there a gap between the young generation and the elderly generation in their support?
Thank you so much for your kind remarks. I actually have read the book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's an amazing piece of scholarship that is very accessible. So if you have time and if you haven't read the book, you should definitely read it. And I assign it in my classes too. So the question is an excellent question. And there is definitely a very important gap that we observe between the younger generations and older generations when it comes to their support for Erdogan. And there is a very important reason for that. Number one, Erdogan is in power for 20 years. And when you think about all those people who were born or who were really kids when he got elected, they don't remember any other leader. They don't remember what was going on in 1990s or early 2000s. And they don't remember anything about, the Turkey that existed before Erdogan. So the country that they were raised in and they were born into was a prosperous country, very much kind of economically viable and promising a lot of good things to their citizens. Now that promise is not being kept. So since 2018, last 4 or 5 years, Turkish citizens, especially the youth, are very disillusioned. They're okay, you actually did a good job when we were kids, but you're not holding your promise, and we want to hold you accountable. So the younger generations in particular are very much holding on to their democratic reflexes, and they want to kind of, keep Erdogan accountable, basically saying, thank you very much for your service. Now, goodbye. We want to have some, new person coming in and new leader ruling the country. That is in general. I'm not saying every single person in the younger generation is in agreement with this, but in general, this is the sentiment that we get from younger generations, even those kids that are coming from lower income neighborhoods. So irrespective of their background, we see the younger generation pretty much kind of coalescing around the sentiment. The older generations are the ones who I've been talking about, with significant loyalty to Erdogan, significant emotional connection to him, and who remember the 1990s, 1980s, and early 2000s and the troubles, and how much Erdogan actually changed their lives. So they're very much kind of looking at this 20 years, and they still appreciate Erdogan's service, and they want to give him another chance, especially conservative older generations coming from urban lower income backgrounds. So there's a very interesting cleavage between urban youth in particular, and the great part of Turkish population is now in urban areas. So the urban youth is very much trying to and hoping to have a new leader and the older generations are still holding on to their support for Erdogan.
I want to thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for wonderful questions and having me. Hopefully we can have another talk later in person.
Yes, yes, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.